So it's been a while since I did a video just talking about different demos that you can play on Steam, and I decided that's exactly what I wanted to do today. Now I think a few of these were actually on Steam Next Fest, or that's where they were featured originally, but a lot of them were either ones that I just stumbled across myself, or they were just, demos that you had recommended in the comments. So all that being said, let's just go ahead and start off with one of the most vivid games that came out of my experimentation with these new demos, and that would be Ultros. Now, I wish I could speak to you more completely about what the premise actually is, but I honestly am not sure because the game starts off in such a weird, just out there, otherworldly way. As far as I can tell, you do play as some sort of a protagonist, perhaps an alien or something that is definitely not of this world, and in just about no time at all, you'll start running across bizarre alien or maybe other dimensional creatures and a whole host of other colorful characters that start to guide you on your journey. And when I say colorful, I mean that in the most literal possible way, because this might just be the most colorful game that I've seen yet for the Steam Deck, and it really made me wish that I already had that OLED model. In fact, I would almost say that it's so colorful and vivid that it almost works to the game's detriment. Now don't get me wrong, I love bold design choices in my Metroidvanias as much as the next player, I suppose, but in Ultros it's almost so retina-searingly vivid that it can sometimes be hard to tell what elements of the environment are actually interactable and which ones are just set dressing. Also, as much as I love the way the alien text looks whenever you find descriptive items within the environment, it's almost impossible to read, and they actually put it twice, once in a more legible font, which, again, I respect their dedication to making sure they have consistent design language. It's something that is definitely all of its own in Ultros, but it is also a little bit impractical in that way, I guess. Also, whenever I'm navigating the Metroid-esque map, I definitely would have preferred a cursor on the map to sort of give me info when hovering over things, especially given how cryptic this game is. But again, visually, this feels like a game that would have been featured in a commercial, one of those, commercial-only episodes of Rick and Morty. Like, seriously, the first time I looked at the description of a battered pom-pom larva, I had no idea what I was even reading, although I will say that I like that it rewards you for skillful play and makes the resources that you gather either higher or lower quality depending on how well you dispatch the foes that you encountered to get it. Again, this is all pretty cryptic stuff, but to the developer's credit, if you go into the key items portion of the menu, there is a dedicated tutorial section that makes a lot of its more nebulous mechanics and world information a bit more clear. Also, some of its more convoluted elements do get clearer the deeper in you get. I won't spoil it, but it's not just a trippy environment for the sake of it. There are legitimate lore reasons for it to exist as it does, and I'm thrilled to find out more about what those are. Combat feels good, if not pretty familiar, and the movement is interesting too. Using the D-pad you can only run, obviously, but if you use the analog stick, you can strut a little bit at a slower pace, which looks amazing. And again, when it comes to the combat, I do appreciate that it rewards skillful play and gives you better quality items whenever you take enemies out. I think that's a little bit more fulfilling than just like some random star rating from mixing it up with good combos. Plus, all of those weird little vittles that you collect directly contribute to unlocking new abilities, which seems a little bit overly laborious, but also kind of refreshing, and I have to admit that after I kind of got in the hang of it, I really started to enjoy that part of Ultros. Plus, it's really interesting that the different parts that you consume work towards your health and towards unlocking new abilities, which kind of gives them some dual functionality. The only thing that gives me some pause about Ultros is the fact that as I looked into the game a little bit more closely and checked out some reviews for it, it turns out that the game does have some roguelite elements as you get deeper into it, so you are going to experience, these scenarios where you're going to lose everything but then gain it back, and I do think it has some provisions to make sure that each subsequent run isn't quite as difficult as the first time you did it, but I know that could be a turnoff for some people, and speaking personally, I do tend to prefer a more straightforward Metroidvania experience without a lot of the looping and the death and trying to grab all of your stuff again, but ultimately this game, again, is so vivid and colorful that I probably will suffer through it just so I can see more of what it has to offer. It's mysterious and alien and weird, and visually it just feels like the complete inverse of Hollow Knight's more monochromatic approach to Metroidvania. Now, I'm not saying it's better or worse than something like Hollow Knight necessarily, it's just really different, and personally I'm a big fan of different, especially when you see a lot of games in this genre just kind of copy what's come before without a lot of deviation from what's already been established. On the performance front, it runs great at 60 FPS, and it does give you some fine-tuned control over post-processing effects, one of which I barely notice is an incredibly subtle scanline effect that after turning it off and back on, I appreciate even more. Also, it has built-in options for balancing performance, which was a nice touch and I'm sure aimed squarely at the Steam Deck. So if you don't mind a dash of roguelike getting mixed in with your Metroidvania and appreciate visuals that look like a Timothy Leary fever dream, this is probably going to resonate with you. And speaking of ultra-colorful visuals, this next game is a completely different sort of trippy that is just aimed squarely at people who grew up on Windows 95, 90s anime, or who just really like Anamanaguchi or that whole Vaporwave aesthetic, and that would be the forthcoming boomer shooter Mullet Mad Jack coming soon. Now, the setup for Mullet Mad Jack is that sometime in the future, mankind has merged with the internet, and in turn, an entirely new kind of being is manifested. In this world, humans need dopamine every 15 seconds or they die out, and the entire world is ruled by rich AI robots called Rebillionaires. And the people who live to kill those robots are called moderators. Your first mission as a moderator is to rescue an influenced princess, which, if all of this sounds a little bit too on the nose for present day, let alone a dystopian techno future, well, you'd be absolutely right. And as someone who is a content creator who has to keep an eye on analytics and the type of videos that you like to watch, it made me a little bit uncomfortable. Because it is a little unseemly murdering robots for likes, but honestly I didn't have too much time to think about the ethics of all of it because, good lord, it is just blindingly fast and saturated, and ironically I just wanted more and more of what Mullet Mad Jack had to offer injected straight into my veins. Now here's the thing, it's not really hard to pander with a retro or even a vaporwave style, especially to an aging millennial like myself who grew up on things like Dragon Ball Z, the Robot series on Saturday mornings, and Sega arcade racers. But Mullet Mad Jack so expertly intertwines style and substance that each perfectly informs the other. It's just completely addictive, and while it definitely comes off a little bit linear since you're constantly racing the clock, running, sliding, shooting, and brutalizing endless waves of enemies is just great fun. Although I will say, as I continued to rush from one area to the next, I did not pay a ton of attention to the environment because there just really wasn't time to. I absolutely love the way it looks, and it's clear that a lot of thought went into the presentation here, but honestly I just felt so compelled to just rush as wildly as possible from point A to point B that my brain felt like it was on fire as I cleared out one robotic hallway after another. And you know, normally I would dock a game for something like this, not because it's objectively bad, but because I personally don't like games that pit me against the timer for the most part. I really hated this in the original Dead Rising, but I kinda gritted my teeth and suffered the clock anyways because the game was so gorgeous when it first came out. But somehow in Mullet Mad Jack it felt a little bit more forgiving, and there is, to their credit, also a baby mode where you can disable the clock entirely, which I may or may not indulge, to be honest, mostly because I do like the idea of stopping to smell the roses in a game like this, because if I hadn't, I might have missed this reference to The Shining on this wallpaper here. If you've ever played an incredibly fast-paced shooter in the vein of Doom or Ghost Runner, you'll have some idea of what to expect. Honestly, it's almost too fast and feels less like a shooter sometimes, and more like you're just bouncing forward at perverse speeds as a human pinball. But hey, it is great fun steamrolling through any enemies that get in your way with a variety of weapons, and even though it is fairly narrow for the most part, there are some more open boss battle sections as well. Performance on the Steam Deck is a little bit of a mixed bag, mostly because the frame rate was kind of all over the place. Sometimes it would drop to the high 30s, and then other times it would be a flat 60. So it would probably make sense to lock this one down to a 40Hz refresh rate with a 40 FPS cap. But honestly, I really didn't notice that much. It's just so fast and janky and loud that I'm not sure I'd ever really mess with optimizing the performance. I mean, at worst it felt like a charming throwback to console games that kind of had that slowdown when you had too many sprites on screen, and at best it kind of gave you a light breather from the blistering action on display. I'm not sure how much I can stomach in its sensory barrage long term, but in short bursts it's super intriguing and I can't wait to see how it does when the full game drops. Alright, so let's go ahead and slow way down and step away from the fast-paced, blistering gameplay of a boomer shooter like Mullet Mad Jack and into the slow, methodical-paced horror of a game like Mouthwashing, which this demo was actually just recently recommended to me by Kung Fu Cash 1, I think that is how it's pronounced. If not, I'm so sorry I butchered that, but yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at some low-poly horror for the Mouthwashing demo. Mouthwashing takes place on a freighter that's traveling through space hauling cargo. Its planned duration of travel is 382 days, and when things kick off, you're about 147 days into your journey. Initially, you're given a little bit of backstory on a portion of the crew, and before long, something goes wrong in the worst possible way. What follows is a macabre story of survival as you and the rest of your crew regroup and try to sort out your next steps. With the ship in disarray, you'll slowly start working through the sequence of events that led to the rough spot you're now in, and piecing together the larger mystery. And Mouthwashing does a great job at drip-feeding you new questions as quickly as it supplies answers. At first, with a name like Mouthwashing, I sort of figured this might be some esoteric sort of horror that would just jump scare you into oblivion with weird stuff for the sake of being weird, but I was delighted to see that that wasn't the case at all. It has interesting characters, tight writing, and not a single jump scare in the entirety of the demo. Don't get me wrong, it's scary if not outright disturbing in the 40 minutes or so you'll spend traversing the ship, but in a slow burn, tension building sort of way, which, for my money, is the cornerstone of any great horror experience. Visually, it falls firmly into the low-poly horror genre, but make no mistake, artistically it's a powerhouse of interesting sci-fi design. How much enjoyment you'll get out of a game like this will depend largely on how much you enjoy narrative-based walking simulators, but if you're someone who appreciates the game's ability to tell a story as much as, if not more, than its raw gameplay, you're gonna have a good time with this one. Especially if you share my fondness for 5th-generation horror aesthetics and cut your survival horror teeth on the genre's earliest entries. And most of its gameplay again revolves around traversing the ship and interacting with members of the crew to piece together what story is being told here. It's also an extremely disorienting game that tends to hop around a lot in terms of the time frame that you're actually exploring, but that actually works out tremendously well for the game as it sort of provides you two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, you get to spend some time seeing everything that happened prior to the inciting event, which, gives you greater insight into the cause and the characters behind it, and then obviously you get to explore what happens afterwards in the most creepy and unsettling way imaginable. Performance is a rock solid 60 throughout, and I was pleased to see that everything just worked great on the deck without any need for adjustment whatsoever. If you rush, you could probably knock out the demo in about 30 minutes, but I would definitely recommend that you do not rush this one. You know, just hang out with it, savor it, explore this horrifying world that you find yourself in. If you love curling up with the Steam Deck in the dead of night to scare yourself silly, this one definitely delivers, and I absolutely cannot wait until the full version of this game drops, because it's probably going to be a day one purchase for me. And finally, speaking of curling up with the Steam Deck for a narrative-based experience, let's brighten things up to round this out with Fall of Porcupine. Fall of Porcupine is set during the beginning of fall, just as summer is winding down, and there's no denying that it sort of has a melancholic feel about it. Which, honestly, that probably makes sense, considering you will be playing as an anthropomorphic pigeon who works at a hospital. And I can't say for sure that the story is going to go to some dark places, but it certainly seems like it might go to at least one or two sad ones based on what I've seen so far with character dialogue. Also, I don't mean to knock this game, but it really does feel like a veritable bingo card of cozy indie game fare, complete with a soothing acoustic soundtrack, quirky relatable animal characters, and no-stress 2D environment navigation that's focused on narrative more than anything else. Again, not to discredit it, when you take all these disparate elements and then tie them together with a warm watercolor aesthetic, it's definitely going to land just right if you're the sort that plays the Steam Deck with a cup of coffee and a blanket nearby, or just has a deep appreciation for Wes Anderson films. Now, on the gameplay front, a lot of this is just sort of traversing and exploring these 2D environments, whether that's the town itself, or actually going to the hospital where you work, and most of your interaction is going to come from talking with other characters. I did experience some light platforming and mini-games when it came to taking care of my patients, although I will say the mechanics for doing so weren't entirely clear to me. And even though I succeeded at some of the skill checks I encountered while being a good doctor, I'm fairly certain that I didn't do the best job that I could, considering it gave me a C rating on every time that I attempted it. But that's the thing, I don't get the impression from Fall of Porcupine at all that it wants to be a game that really focuses on how well you can play with its mechanics. Rather, I get the idea that it's just really trying to tell a good story with relatable characters that feel like the people you talk to in everyday life, and just offering a really grounded experience despite a very cartoonish presentation. I would imagine if you've played games like Beacon Pines or A Night in the Woods that this is going to be a very welcome game for you to just sort of chill out with. Performance on the deck was predictably rock solid at 60 FPS, which tends to be the case for most 2D games. And again, I would bet if you're somebody who likes those almost storybook-like narrative games that have a very chill aesthetic about it, you're probably going to dig what's on offer here in Fall of Porcupine. I don't think I would call it my favorite out of all of the demos that I played, but it was definitely the most relaxing out of all of the demos that I played, so if you're somebody who does value those sort of relaxing experiences, might be worth a look. Alright, and that's it for this one. Normally I like to have 5 entries on a list like this, but I kind of had this weird thing happen where I bought Pacific Drive and started playing it and kind of fell in love with it very, very quickly. And I thought there was a demo for that game, but I could not find it, or maybe I got some bad information, so long story short, Pacific Drive's really good too, but I'm going to do a full video on that later on this week, assuming I can get the edits done, because again, it is a super complicated game, but yeah, for now, these are the demos that I kind of laid out here and had a lot of fun with over the past couple weeks. But hey, what about you? Have you played any great demos lately? If so, is there anything you would recommend? If so, please do let me know in the comments below. As always, take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.